Spring 1943, over the occupied skies of Europe, German airmen faced a new American fighter that would revolutionize air combat. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt rolled over the continent like something out of a bad dream. Huge radial engines protruded forward. Bulky fusiliers looked more in place to haul freight than to fight in the air. Small stumpy wings looked unable to make at tight turns that characterized fighter battles. German airmen, warriors of years of conflict, initially dismissed these ungainly machines. They flew sleek, agile fighters that had been designed by the world's greatest aeronautic engineers. Within months, that dismissive attitude would become grudging respect, then fear, then a desperate acknowledgement that the Americans had introduced something different to European skies. A machine created not for elegance but for destruction, not for demonstration but for survival, not for individual glory but for industrial victory. The tale of German airmen learning to fear the Thunderbolt would be one of the most dramatic psychological convergence of the air war. It concluded with 86,000 destroyed targets in 11 months. This is the tale of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. May 6, 1941. Farmingdale, New York. Test pilot Lowry Brabham got into the cockpit of an aircraft unlike any the United States Army Air Corps had ever. The Republic Aviation Corporation's new fighter prototype rested on the runway like a tank with wings. 8 tons of airplane at maximum takeoff weight, over twice the weight of most modern fighters. Alexander Kartveli, the Russian immigrant who was Republic's chief designer, had produced something unprecedented. When air combat reports from Europe in 1940 arrived at his desk, they mentioned a new reality of fighter warfare. Pilots required altitude performance beyond 30,000 feet. They required firepower to knock down increasingly armored aircraft. They required toughness to withstand the new generation of heavy machine guns and cannon German and British fighters mounted. Kartveli defied conventional wisdom. Rather than seeking agility and lightness, he designed for strength and power. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial delivering 2,000 horsepower, became the center of his design. But fitting such a potent engine presented problems. The turbo supercharger unit had to have extensive ducting through the underside of the aircraft. This accounted for the P-47's distinctive barrel shape, an engineering necessity rather than an aesthetic decision. The firepower was greater than had ever been placed on any American fighter. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, 4 on each wing. Each gun held between 267 and 425 rounds by position. Overall ammunition capacity of 3,400 rounds. When all 8 guns fired together, they presented a weight of fire heavier than any American fighter in history, save the Northrop P-61 Black Widow night fighter. Brabham released the brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The huge radial engine thundered to maximum power. The Thunderbolt picked up speed down the runway, heavy but intent. At 75 miles per hour, Brabham eased back on the stick. The prototype rose steadily despite its weight. Climbing through 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000, the plane performed perfectly. At 30,000 feet, where most fighters were struggling for height, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger system found its niche. The engine ran at full power. Brabham leveled the nose and dived. The airspeed indicator passed 400 miles per hour, 450, and approached 500. The controls remained responsive, the airframe solid. When he landed 4 or 5 minutes later, Brabham's report confirmed what Kartveli suspected. They had created something revolutionary. Not the most agile fighter, not the longest range, but potentially the most survivable and heavily armed fighter aircraft in the world. June 1942, Bridgeport, Connecticut. The 56th Fighter Group began receiving their first P-47 Thunderbolts. Pilots who switched from light fighters were immediately culture shocked. Captain Robert Johnson, who was to become one of America's top aces, later recounted his initial reaction. "I thought they had sent a medium bomber in error. The cockpit was 9 feet above the ground when the tailwheel was on the pavement. Pilots required a ladder to get aboard. Forward ground visibility was so restricted thought pilots needed to be led by the crew chiefs while taxiing. The plane weighed 14,000 pounds, loaded 7 tons of fighter that filled the tarmac with its mass. But in the air, pilots found surprising attributes. The cockpit was roomy, a luxury on combat planes. Tall pilots who could not fit snugly in other fighters enjoyed the Thunderbolt's room. One pilot quipped, "You could nearly walk around inside on long missions." An exaggeration, but a sign of the extra space. The controls, though heavy, responded in synchrony with the plane's weight. The P-47 did not prance through the air like a German Bf-109. It ruled by sheer muscle and power. Colonel Hubert Zemke commanded 56th Fighter Group in January 1943. Had served as a combat observer with Royal Air Force in 19 and had understood air warfare against the Luftwaffe. He realized at once that Thunderbolt needed tactics different from those employed by the lighter fighters. German pilots had become masters of turning combat at medium and low levels. Their fighters could outturn nearly anything in the sky in a crossing date, but the P-47 had aces up its sleeve. They could not counter at high altitude. ZMI created the boom and zoom strategy that would characterize Thunderbolt combat doctrine. Climb to 30,000 feet or higher. Utilize the greater high-altitude performance to build energy and position advantage. Dive on enemy formations at speeds of from approaching or beyond 500 miles per hour. Fire the destructive 8-gun armament. Utilize the dive speed to get clear before enemies could react. Return to altitude and repeat. It was energy fighting in its purest expression. The Thunderbolt was unable to turn with German fighters, but could dive bomb them, climb above them at altitude, and take damage that would destroy another fighter. April 13, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group conducted their first combat mission from Horsham St. Faith Airfield in England. Major General William Keeptoner, commanding the 8th Air Force fighter units, had issued specific instructions. Escort of bombers was the main mission. Guard the heavy bombers striking German industrial objectives. Do not engage enemy fighters unless required to accomplish this mission. The Thunderbolts rendezvous with a squadron of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses at 25,000 feet above the English Channel. The stream of bombers extended for miles. Dozens of 4-engine planes bound for targets in occupied Europe. German radar installations monitored their approach. Luftwaffe fighter groups scrambled from airfields in northern France and Belgium. The initial interceptions were in the region of the Belgian coast. Mesmid Bf-109 and Fowler-Wolf F-190 fighters rose to intercept the Americans. German pilots had spent 3 years of war mastering tactics. They were aware of how to use the weaknesses of bomber formations. They knew escort fighter capability and their limitations. What they did not yet know fully was the Thunderbolt. Within the next 3 months, Luftwaffe fighter units were to meet Thunderbolts with growing Every encounter repeated the same cycle. American pilots would not turn combat. They attacked from altitude with speed and dive capability, and their aircraft took punishment that would have crippled German fighters. June 26, 1943. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, pilot of P-47D serial number 23906. All hell faced a reality that would render the Thunderbolt legendary. Johnson had escorted bombers deep into Germany. Turning for home, low on fuel, a flight of German fighters cornered him alone. What transpired was one of the best documented survival stories of the air war. German fighters strafed again and again, pumping hundreds of rounds into Johnson's plane. His canopy stalled. Hydraulic fluid sprayed over the windscreen. Control cables were cut. The fuselage was a sieve of bullet holes. Johnson lagged more than 200 hits upon landing. His wingman had been downed. He was only crippled 200 meters from safety. But the Pratt & Whitney R-280 continued to run. Redundant control systems and the thick aluminum skin made the aircraft fly. Johnson nursed battered Thunderbolt across occupied Europe, unable to bail out because of the jammed canopy. Struggling to stay in the air with mangled controls. A Fowler-Wolf F-190 glided along beside him. The German pilot gazed at the shattered Thunderbolt, clearly visible through bullet-riddled fuselage. He could see Johnson in the cockpit, badly hurt but alive. The two pilots flew in formation for a long time. Then the German pilot nodded in respect to a dead man and rolled away without firing. No German fighter could have lived through what he observed. The pilot must have thought Johnson would crash in a few minutes. Johnson returned to England. Ground crews counted 210 bulletin cannon shell hits. The fuselage resembled scrap metal, ready to be sold for scrap. But after 3 weeks of repairs, all hell broke out again in combat. News of Johnson's survival circulated through American and German squadrons. For American pilots, it confirmed the Thunderbolt's legendary durability. For German pilots, it raised unsettled. What type of plane could withstand such punishment and remain airworthy? What did this reveal about American engineering ability? What did it mean to pilots who had become used to their own fighters' comparative delicacy? October 8, 1943. Major Hans Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's top-scoring aces with more than 200 victories verified, led his fighter wing on an intercept mission. Philipp represented the Luftwaffe elite. He had flown Marathon 500 combat missions. He was the recipient of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's top honors. He was all but invincible. At 30,000 feet above Germany, his formation ran into Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group. The Americans had altitude superiority. Philipp's engine was losing power in the thin air. The Mesmet Bf-109 built for low-level combat below 25,000 feet struggled at this height. The Thunderbolts dived. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, piloting the same plane that survived the June attack, commanded his flight into firing position. His combat report was short. Received hits on the body. Plane burst. No parachute. Hans Philipp, the veteran ace who survived 500 missions, lost his life within seconds. That psychological effect resonated in Luftwaffe squadrons. If Philipp could not survive on these American fighters, what chance did mediocre pilots stand? The Flying Barrel, once ridiculed, had slain one of Germany's best. American tactics had reached their full development by autumn 1943. Thunderbolt pilots no longer fought with turns. They employed speed and height as their weapons. German pilots were pushed into defensive attitudes, never being able to catch the Americans at 30 and 0 feet, never able to get out when Thunderbolts descended from on high. The weaknesses of the P-47 still lingered. Range was short. The giant radial engine burned fuel at monumental rates. Early models could escort bombers only to the German border and then back. But engineers did this systematically. .75 Gulldrop tanks stretched range to 230 miles in August. 1,943.108 paper tanks stretched range to 275 miles in September. By April 1944, wing pylons plumbed for fuel-enabled 425 miles combat radius. Still not sufficient to reach Berlin. That mission would fall to the longer-range North American P-51 Mustang. But within range, the Thunderbolt did superbly. And with the start of 1944, American planners recognized a new role that would exploit the Thunderbolt's strengths to the fullest. January 1944. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force started planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Air control of the invasion beaches was absolute necessity. But, in addition to air control, planners required something else. They required the systematic destruction of German transportation network. Every railroad, every bridge, every supply depot, each concentration of troops. Ground attack sorties, which would risk aircraft to lethal anti-aircraft fire. The P-47 Thunderbolt was designed for this task. Its 18-cylinder radial engine with 2 rows could take damage which would destroy an inline engine. Lose 2 or 3 cylinders and the engine continued to run. Its heavy aluminum skin would stop 20 mm and 37 mm. Anti-aircraft shells and stay aloft. Its level wing shape gave stability for strafing and dive bombing. And its 850 caliber machine guns could tear anything on the ground to shreds. Lieutenant Colonel Glenn Duncan of Cheddar Leobertil 60, the 353rd Fighter Group, initiated low-level attack techniques in March 1944. Duncan, a tall Texan with a fighting personality, persuaded commanders Toprov operational evaluation of the Thunderbolt as a low-level, fast strafer. He commanded demonstration missions that demonstrated the plane's potential against ground targets. It far surpassed expectations. Thunderbolts were able to dive from altitude, strike at rates of up to 400 miles per hour, take defensive fire, and recover to safety. Pilots mastered the ability to recognize targets from high altitude, map attack runs that kept them away from flak, and synchronize timing so planes strafed or bombed targets with simultaneous hits. By April of 1944, all 9th Air Force P-47 units had switched to the fighter bomber. They operated dive bombing with 500 1,000-pound bombs. They perfected M84.5 and rocket, known as bazookas, by pilots. They mastered strafing techniques using the 8-gun armament. They developed ground attack specialties while retaining air combat capability. Thunderbolts laid waste to northern France on the eve of D-Day. Railroad marshalling yards were ablaze. Bridges fell. Supply convoys detonated on highways. Airfields became useless, cratered moonscapes. The attack specifically shrouded the whole region from Brittany to Pas-de-Calais, shielding German intelligence from determining the real invasion location. German commanders were aware of the threat. Anti-aircraft defenses were heightened. 88 mm flak batteries were placed around vital structures. Lighter 20 mm and 37 mm guns guarded convoys and soldier locations. Even small arms fire was risked to aircraft low-altitude attack. Thunderbolt losses were higher, but the proportion remained. Out of 100 sorties, fewer than one plane was lost. The tough construction that had salvaged Robert Johnson helped salvage hundreds of other pilots. Planes came back with engines losing cylinders, with control surfaces torn, with hydraulic systems ruptured, with fuel tanks holed, and they continued flying. Lieutenant Ray Murphy piloted a P-47, nicknamed Chief Seattle. On January 22, 1944, his squadron struck the 6th SS Panzer Army, boarding trains for transport to the Eastern Front. Flak filled the skies. Murphy's plane was hit by 240 mm and 120 mm shell. The hits blew out an entire tire, ruptured the hydraulic system, and knocked 2 cylinders off the engine. Murphy was able to maintain the disabled plane for 75 miles to base. The Arist Strip was strewn with, touching down on a good tire and a blown tire, 7 tons of lightning on compromised landing gear, careened off the runway and crashed into a field of snow. Murphy shut off the engine to avoid fire and exited safely. Chief Seattle returned to battle after repair. It was ultimately lost on April 18, 1945. In a takeoff accident after surviving months off combat that would have reduced lesser aircraft to ruins many times over. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Operation Overlord began with the greatest amphibious assault of all time. Allied air forces made more than 14,000 sorties on D-Day alone. Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force gave closer support for troops when they went ashore. They struck They interdicted roads so that reinforcements could not reach the coast. They flew combat air patrol over the invasion fleet. The Luftwaffe briefly showed themselves, swamped and useless. Years of attrition had worn down German fighter numbers. Veteran pilots were dead or in POW camps. Replacement pilots showed up at frontline units with little training. Gasoline shortages restricted flight time. Aircraft production was bogged down by Allied strategic bombing, and every place German troops went, Thunderbolts came out of the sky. The strategic breakdown of transportation infrastructure paid off. German armored divisions spent days to travel distances they could have traveled in hours. Supply convoys ran at night, concealing themselves from aircraft by day. Railroad transport was suicidal. Pilots became intimately familiar with the road system in France. They memorized landmarks, river crossings, towns. They coordinated with ground units over the radio. Tank officers could call in air support and accurately describe targets. Thunderbolt pilots would show up overhead within minutes, identified target from the description, and strike. July 29, 1944. Operation Cobra. The American breakout from Normandy, a short distance east of the town of Rosny, trapped German troops between advancing American armored divisions made a bid to escape. The 405th Fighter Group intercepted them on the road. From 3:10 in the afternoon until 9:40 in the evening, Thunderbolts strafed in relays, bombs, rockets, strafing runs with 8-gun armor. When ground forces arrived location the following morning, they discovered extensive devastation. Varying accounts are reported by multiple sources, but the devastation was unmistakable. Dozens of tanks reduced to rubble, hundreds of vehicles, pieces of artillery strewn along miles of road. The deliberate destruction rendered retreat impossible. This became the routine throughout France. German troops that tried to retreat were subject to systematic destruction by air. The Files Pocket in August 1944 became a slaughter ground on which Thunderbolts and other friendly aircraft were cutting down encircled German units. Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller, Luftwaffe ace, who had questioned the Thunderbolts' usefulness early in 1943, saw his men annihilated from the skies. Post-war, he acknowledged his mistake. We made fun of them in 1943. No one laughs today. He observed that Thunderbolt guns never jammed, never overheated, and the planes outmatched every expectation. It was termed the perfect fighter-bomber by him. Post-war statistics indicate the extent of the destruction. Between D-Day on the 6th of June 1944 and Victory in Europe Day, the 8th of May 1945, a total duration of 11 months. P-47 Thunderbolts destroyed or disabled 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. These numbers accounted for all the theaters where Thunderbolts were used in Europe. The figure of 86,000 was a conservative count from gun camera photos and pilot accounts that could be corroborated. Actual loss was surely greater. A large number of the targets were burnt after planes, ground forces and artillery wrecked cars first crippled by air attack. The stresses off combat precluded accurate accounting, but even modest estimates spoke volumes. In 11 months, Thunderbolt pilots had methodically taken apart the German military's capacity to transport forces and supplies. Each blown-up locomotive and trains that couldn't operate. Each ruined railroad car meant supplies that couldn't make it to the front. Each ruined truck meant units that couldn't move. Each ruined tank meant armor that couldn't engage. German commanders attempted to adjust. They marched in darkness. They scattered troops to reduce salient targets. They camouflaged vehicles and entrenched when planes arrived. But adjustment was limited. Mechanized warfare in the modern age demanded mobility. Supplies needed to get to troops. Reinforcements must come to the front. Armored divisions must move. And each movement was open to attack. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Germany initiated Operation Watch on the Rhine, a surprise attack through Belgium to split Allied forces. American intelligence had not seen the buildup. Weather obscured aerial reconnaissance. Entire German armored divisions mustered in the forest under cover of cloud and fog. The attack enjoyed total tactical surprise. German troops flooded through American lines, producing a bulge in the Allied line. The Battle of the Bulge was the largest land battle in which the United States Army fought, with 600,000 American troops involved. Weather continued to be horrible, low cloud cover, snow, fog, weather that grounded planes. For days, the German troops pushed and Allied air power remained. But when the weather cleared on December 23, the Luftwaffe learned what total air supremacy was. Thunderbolt missions flew the front lines all the time. They found German columns trying to bring in supplies and reinforcements. They strafed convoys. They blocked. They attacked at every opportunity. Lieutenant First Class Leslie Bose-Fluis, P-47, dubbed Blonde Trouble, on a strafing mission off-note, Germany, and December 17. His flight commander bombed a Wehrmacht convoy. As planes came up from their strafing runs, a massive explosion burst up from below. A lightning bolt streaking through the debris cloud was struck by shrapnel. The plane started smoking profusely. Bose yelled over the radio. The stricken P-47 kept flying. Pilot, struggling to regain control. The plane managed to get back across Allied lines before belly landing in a snowy field. Pilot emerged with superficial injuries. Another tribute to Thunderbolt ruggedness. The Luftwaffe made one last effort. On the 1st of January, 1945, close to 1,000 German bombers and fighters made a surprise attack on Allied air bases as part of Operation Bodenplatte. They attained surprise, destroying more than 200 Allied planes on the ground, including many P-47s, but the losses were expendable. American industry provided aircraft faster than combat could kill them. German losses in Bodenplatte, more than 200 aircraft and close to 300 pilots were indispensable. The battle busted the Luftwaffe back. Towards the end of January 1945, German defenses in the Ardennes disintegrated. Allied troops faced out the Bulge and continued their drive into Germany. Thunderbolts resumed their methodical destruction off German installations. Bridge after bridge, marshalling yard after marshalling yard, supply depot after supply depot. The attritional campaign went on. First Lieutenant Trobert Brel flew low-level support missions from K-29 airfield in Belgium throughout January 1945. He explained the close coordination with ground troops. Tank commanders radioed in coordinates. Fighter pilots overhead found targets by description. You would have some army man in a Sherman tank speaking to you over the radio. When you came overhead, he would tell you, for example, we need you to destroy the German tank behind the small farmhouse that has the red roof. The issue was that there were dozens offered roofed farmhouses were in sight from altitude. To remedy this, fighter pilots rotated to the front lines. They attached themselves to ground units and controlled airstrikes personally. They could use pilot language and view the battlefield from ground level. This coordination rendered Thunderbolt strikes horribly effective. The last months of the war became a rout. German forces retreated over the Rhine. Allied armies rolled 50 miles some days. Thunderbolts prowled Germany searching for targets. They encountered columns of horse-drawn artillery, evidence of total German logistical breakdown. They encountered aircraft hidden in woods, destroyed on the ground before taking flight. They encountered trains carrying supplies, destroyed en route to troops. Pilots encountered growing danger from small arms fire. Desperate German troops fired at anything flying, but the Thunderbolt's durity kept people alive. Lieutenant Cliffs, received a 20 or 37 mm shell in his engine, cowling during strafing of trucks at Surmand on November 20, 1944. The engine remained operational with the cylinders damaged. Oil sprayed onto the windscreen, obscuring forward vision. His wingman persuaded him back to base 125 miles away. The plane landed safely. April 1945. Allied troops pushed deep into Germany. The war was at its end, but Thunderbolt pilots continued to fly daily sorties. Lieutenant First Class Raymond, Knight of the 346th Fighter Squadron, 350th Fighter Group, offered again and again to raid enemy airfields. On April 24th and 25th, he flew his P-47D, "Oh Johnny," into heavy ground fire on low-altitude reconnaissance and strafing missions. Knight's show of aggression destroyed many German planes on the ground. But on the 25th of April, ground fire hit his plane while on a strafing run. The Thunderbolt crashed. Knight was killed in the crash. He was awarded posthumously Medal of Honor for his actions, one of only 2 P-47 pilots to receive Theckentrie's highest honor. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The European War ended. Final figures disclosed the Thunderbolt's impact. More than 746,000 sorties of all descriptions. An aerial kill ratio of 4.6 to 1. In excess of 7,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. Over half in air-to-air combat. More in-ground attacks. 0.7% loss rate per mission. Extremely low for the severity of operations. 15,683 P-47s. Produced from 1941 to 1,945.3. 499 lost to all causes in combat. More P-47s were manufactured than any other American fighter in history. The sheer extent of production proved American. pled industrial capacity. But statistics do not fully convey the Thunderbolt's importance. The plane was a revolution in fighter design concept. Fighters of the past prioritized agility, speed, and lightness. The Thunderbolt prioritized firepower, toughness, and survivability. It traded weight for protection. It compromised maneuverability for disastrous armament. It favored pilots' return home over optimal performance. This approach was American strategic thinking. The United States might construct thousands of fighters. It might train thousands of pilots. But each pilot spared. Each plane that came back, even though damaged, increased combat power. A pilot who survived his first tour could fly a second tour. A plane that landed, even though damaged in battle, could be fixed and sent back into combat. German fighters, beautiful and high performance, tended to be delicate. One round through the cooling system of a Bf-109's inline engine meant forced landing. Control system damage translated to loss of planes. German pilots were often forced to bail out of crippled fighters. American pilots and Thunderbolts would often be able to nurse home disabled planes. The psychological effect on German pilots was extreme. Awareness that the enemy planes could take unbelievable beating, and that their own fighters couldn't, created stress round the clock. Every battle was riskier. Every shot-up planes meant a dead or captured pilot instead of a reparable machine. Luftwaffe Einheitsbeer, who lived through the war with 220 confirmed victories, testified to German respect for the Thunderbolt. He stated that the P-47 could take an incredible amount of lead and that it had to be flown very cautiously. From a pilot who had campaigned for 6 years, who had flown against every Allied fighter type, who was one of the Luftwaffe's most talented survivors. This judgment held credibility. The change in German perspectives was absolute. From April 1943's scorn, Tofferful, respect by 1945. From derisive nickname of Flying Barrel to recognition as the ideal fighter bomber. The plane that resembled a barrel had achieved that combat worthiness originated not from graceful lines but of brutal ability. Thunderbolts kept serving after the war ended. Aircraft stayed in frontline service with the United States Air Force until 1949. Air Forces flew P-47s through the 1950s. The Brazilian Air Force earned Presidential Unit Citation during the 1980s. For their World War II Thunderbolt operations in Italy, their very first fighter squadron completed 445 missions between November 1944 and May 1945, demonstrating that Thunderbolt capabilities were beyond American grasp. The 56th Fighter Group, which operated Thunderbolts during the war, tallied 677.5 aerial victories and 311 ground kills at a price of 128 aircraft. They were the sole 8th Air Force unit that did not switch to P-51 Mustangs, instead insisting on retaining their Thunderbolts. Their devotion to the aircraft reflected pilot faith in the design. Colonel Francis Gabreski, who emerged as the top American top scorer in the European theater with 28 verified victories, all in P-47s, later commented on the aircraft. He spoke of its roomy cockpit, its reliability, its power to get pilotship. He conceded that it wasn't the fastest or most maneuverable fighter, but in his opinion, the war's best fighter bomber. The surviving Thunderbolts were precious. WARBIRDS. Museums everywhere exhibit P-47s. A few are still flyable, flying at air shows and commemorative events. When a restored Thunderbolt takes to the skies, the thunder of the R-280 radial engine at maximum power is still unmistakable. A deep thundering roar, echoing the name of the aircraft. Contemporary Air Force learned from the Thunderbolt's design philosophy. The design philosophy of an attack aircraft heavily armed and heavily armored. Putting survival first influenced subsequent designs. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, conceived in the 1970s for close air support, nominally paid respect to the P-47's heritage in its designation. The A-10, also called Warthog, imposes the same philosophy. Heavy armament, armor shielding, ruggedness rather than speed, capacitito, take a beating, and keep flying. The historical record is unequivocal. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't the prettiest World War II fighter. It wasn't the fastest or the most maneuverable. It never got the longest range until late-model designs arrived. But measured by combat capability, measured by survival rates of pilots, by sheer destructive power, by the conversion of enemy respect to mockery and then to fear, the Thunderbolt is one of the greatest fighters ever constructed. 80,000 targets destroyed in about 11 months. D-Day to victory in Europe. Railroad cars, locomotives, armored vehicles, trucks, the systematic taking apart of German military logistics. The grinding devastation of an enemy's capacity, to supply, to fight. This was the Thunderbolt's legacy. Captain Vero, who radioed that the Americans were flying barrels on April 15, 1943, survived the war. He never flew combat again after 1944, wounded in action. In post-war interviews, he admitted his initial assessment was incorrect. The flying barrels had turned out to be one of the most successful combat planes of the war. Their unsightly, ungainingly appearance-hidden, destructive power. The evolution of the nickname itself is telling. Flying barrel originally started as derision, a condescending remark on the part of seasoned pilots who critiqued planes by looks. But when German troops fought across Europe under relentless air bombardment, when supply routes were aflame, as every advance threatened annihilation from the air, the nickname gained another connotation. The flying barrel was something to be feared. 68,000 trucks incinerated. Each truck stood for supplies that never made it to the front. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, replacement parts. The net effect was the starvation of German war capability. Units were unable to move, unable to fight, unable to defend, because the supplies didn't arrive. 9,000 locomotives. In an age when rail transport delivered most military logistics, every destroyed locomotive equaled trains unable to move. Supplies piled up in marshalling yards. Reinforcements stay wounded troops who could not be evacuated. The railway system was the circulatory system of German military strength. Thunderbolts systematically dismantled it. 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed. Tanks, self-propelled guns, armored personnel carriers. Each destroyed vehicle meant diminished combat capacity. German armored formations, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, were whittled down by relentless air attack. Divisions that entered campaigns with full strength reached battlefronts with fraction of their vehicles. The attrition was 86,000 destroyed railroad cars, a tremendous figure that set the pace for the destruction of material capability by systematic means. Every railroad car could have contained tons of supplies. 86,000 times, and the figure sets millions of tons of supplies that didn't reach German troops. Food, ammunition, fuel, equipment, all laid waste before it ever reached the battlefield. These figures tallied up from gun camera shots, and confirmed pilot reports were conservative estimates. Destruction was greater than documented statistics. Numerous targets were incinerated following attacking aircraft departures. Secondary blasts eliminated automobiles in proximity to primary targets. Wrecked cars were subsequently eliminated by artillery or ground elements. Exact totals were not feasible during the confusion of battle. Butovan lowball estimates indicated an irrefutable tale. American industrial output, translated to combat aircraft, translated to pilot training, translated to tactical doctrine, had attained systematic military infrastructure. The mocked and ridiculed flying barrel of 1943 had by 1945 become the tool of German military logistics destruction. The lesson did not stay within World War II. The Thunderbolt campaign was studied by modern military strategists. They learned that air superiority paired with systematic interdiction could defeat large, well-equipped ground forces. The theory of deep battle, bombing enemy supplies and reserves before they arrived at the front, was proven by Thunderbolt sorties in Iraq. The P-47 proved aircraft design to be a matter of compromise. Peak performance in one aspect constituted accepting deficiencies in others. The designers of the Thunderbolts opted for firepower and survivability over range and agility. That decision was right. Fourth missions the planes actually performed. Ground attack demanded toughness more than versatility. Survivability was more important than top speed. Fighter pilots understood that tactics were as important as aircraft performance. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke's boom and zoom philosophy enabled Thunderbolt pilots to use their aircraft's strengths and bypass its weaknesses. Energy combat at high altitude canceled German turning capability. Diving attack employed weight and power as weapons. This tactical development made the Thunderbolt a dynamic energy fighter from a mediocre turning fighter. The 5-6 fighter group's devotion to the Thunderbolt. Its refusal to switch to Mustangs when all other 8th Air Force units did so indicated pilot faith. These people had flown combat missions day after day for 2 years. They knew the Thunderbolt's abilities and limitations intimately. Their decision to continue flying, it said a lot about the plane's qualities. Contemporary pilots flying restored Thunderbolts say that the airplane has a solid, stable, and strong feel. Controls are heavy and positive. Visibility is good once airborne. The noise and vibration of the huge radial engine give continuous feedback. The airplane gives a sense of confidence by pure solidity. One pilot said that flying it was like flying a tank, intended as a compliment, not criticism. The Thunderbolt's historic importance goes beyond the statistics of combat. The aircraft embodied American industrial philosophy in the context of war. Build it heavy, build it strong, build it durable, accept weight in lieu of capability. Prioritize quantity and quality over time, rather than pursuing maximum performance at the expense of everything else. This philosophy paid off. 15,683 aircraft produced. A production sequence that proved manufacturing capability. Each plane needed thousands of parts, produced by subcontractors throughout the United States, assembled at Republic Aviation's factories in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. The supply chain management, quality control, and workforce training necessary to produce over 15,000 complex aircraft during wartime represented organizational achievement, matching the technical achievement of the design itself. Every P-47 that rolled off the production line represented American economic power, translated into military capability. Aluminum refined from bauxite mines, steel forged in Pittsburgh, rubber from electronics from radio factories, instruments from precision machine shops, engines from Pratt & Whitney factories, all coordinated, all synchronized, all shipped to Republic Aviation for final assembly. German aircraft companies made fine designs but could not keep up with American production levels. The Faller Wolf FW-190, probably Germany's finest piston engine fighter, had 20,000 examples produced during the whole war, more than the Thunderbolt, but made in a longer span of time. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, Germany's leadingly produced fighter, peaked at over 33,000 models. Sensational. But divided between several variants and manufactured over 6 years of war. American production off-fighters reached more than 99,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945. P-40 Warhawks, P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-63 King, P-80 Shooting Stars. The sheer number swamped Axis production. 4-inch German fighter lost. American factories turned out 2 replacements, 3 replacements, 5 replacements. This production superiority, added to greater pilot training and tactical adaptability, formed an unbreakable combination. German pilots were confronted with mounting numbers of increasingly experienced adversaries in increasingly effective. The rate of attrition was in favor of the Allies by a wide margin. Experienced German pilots were killed. Replacements came with little training. Aircraft quality decreased as material shortage led to substitutions and simplifications. The Luftwaffe entered a death spiral from which it never. The Thunderbolt played a major role in this attrition. Its low rate of loss means served to fly several tours. Its heavy armament made it lethal in air and ground warfare. Its ruggedness translated into aircraft return after battle damage for repair and reuse. Cumulative effect multiplied combat power over time. In the final reckoning, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt is one of history's greatest combat aircraft. Not because it ranked highest at any particular measure of performance, but because it was fantastically effective at the missions it flew. Because it returned pilots home alive. Because it systematically and relentlessly destroyed enemy capabilities. Because ET changed from a ridiculed flying barrel to a dreaded weapon of destruction. 86,000 targets in 11 months. A figure nearly too great to imagine. Consider it differently. 7,800 targets destroyed monthly. 258 targets daily. Each and every day for 11 months. 10 targets an hour, day and night. A ceaseless grinding demolition of German capability. The Germans dubbed it flying barrel. They used it in derision, but history recalls it as one of the planes that won World War II, the barrel that contributed to the destruction of the Third Reich.